Bring this meeting to order of the Budget Kickoff 2025 with our leadership team. You all are dressed up and looking snazzy. Well done. Welcome to all of you who came this morning to talk about our most important resource of the county, and that's how we spend our money for the constituents. Just to get ourselves familiar, obviously everybody knows everybody around the table, but for the public, I'd like to just start to my left and go around the table and introduce one another, and just so the public knows who's here.
Thank you. Good morning. Lane County Commissioner for District 3, Lori Trieger.
Dan Hurley, Public Works Director.
Lauren Blythe, Director of Operations.
Mike Finch, Director of Technology Services.
Mary Vuxit Schaefer, Assessor Tax Collector.
Eve Gray, Director of Health and Human Services.
Cliff Harold, Sheriff.
Steve Adams, Policy Director.
Steve Mokrajewski, County Administrator.
Christine Moody, Budget Manager.
Greg Rickoff, Assistant County Administrator.
Alana Holmes, Chief Human Resources Officer.
Pat Farr, Board of County Commissioners.
Vice Chair Ryan Senega.
And Chair David Lovell. Very good. We got about a 90% on the microphone etiquette, so I just want to remind everyone today, Commissioner Buck is also online. And Commissioner Buck, if you want to introduce yourself, go ahead.
County Commissioner for District 5. Thank you.
All right, and remember that she's online, so we want our microphones close to our mouths so she can hear every word that we say today. So on to the business of the county. Our first item up is the local economic update from Mr. Brian Rooney, our state economic person for Lane County. Brian's got a presentation, so I'll give it to you. Brian, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm going to see if I can figure out how to move these slides forward.
Steve, make sure you move his mic closer.
Looks like I got it. Laser, too. All right. So today, I'm going to talk about Lane County labor market data, housing affordability, and our latest projections. Aside from what I just mentioned, I had a request to put together some data about rural Lane County. So we have the urban-rural comparison. So employment and unemployment during the ongoing economic recovery. So Lane County has almost reached pre-pandemic employment levels. Lane County lost over 25,000 jobs, or 15%, in the spring of 2020, and has now gained back 25,300, or 98% of those jobs. So we're just about back up to that pre-pandemic peak. Statewide, Oregon lost 14% between January and April of 2020, and has gained back 117% of what was lost by November 2024. The state topped pre-pandemic levels in January of 2023, and since then it's been pretty slow growth statewide. Okay, this is employment growth coming out of the pandemic, so June 2019 to June 2024. And all industries have grown coming out of the pandemic recession. There's a couple that were especially affected by restrictions during the pandemic, especially health services and leisure and hospitality, and government for that matter. And those are the industries that grew back the most. They had the most to recover. In government, a lot of that is public schools reopening. And of course, leisure and hospitality had the most restrictions and has had a pretty good rebound. This is over the year, June 23 to June 24. Employment growth is slow, but is still positive. Employment is up 1,400 jobs, or 0.8% over the year. A couple of industries have lost jobs. Construction is a little surprising, down 400, but we're expecting that to turn around in the coming months. Retail trade isn't that surprising. For retail trade, the brick and mortar stores keep reducing and closing, and that's just because of electronic shopping. So retail trade is down. Financial activities is up. In there's insurance, all types of insurance, including health insurance, and real estate. Property management is a small amount of employment, but we've seen some growth there also. Private education and health services, that's almost all health services. There's just a lot of demand for health services with the aging population, and that continues to grow, have strong growth. Leisure and hospitality continues to recover from the pandemic. Actually, there's still a little growth to go there as far as recovery from the pandemic. Government up 600. There's growth at the University of Oregon, but also in non-education local government. There's a lot of money coming down from the federal government and state government for things like infrastructure and affordable housing. So that needs to be implemented at the local level. So we're seeing some growth in non-education local government. Unemployment rates are near record lows. Lane County's 2024 November rate was 4.1%. I'm sorry, it's 4.2%, about the same as the November 2023. As it was in November 2023, and down from a high of 14.6% in April 2020. Lane County's record low is 3.5% set in November 2019. So for the past couple of years, we've really just been staying down near that record low. So it's a tight labor market, and there are a couple of reasons for that we'll get into. Oregon statewide rate, 4.1%, and U.S. unemployment rate, 4.2%, so we compare favorably with the state and national numbers. Workforce trends. So these are vacancies, quarterly vacancy, job vacancies. And we're getting back down to pre-pandemic levels with the vacancies. You can see prior to the pandemic, we were kind of cruising along 4,000 to 6,000 vacancies, down a little bit for the pandemic, but then after the pandemic, There was a lot of demand for labor, and vacancies got very high. Stayed elevated in 2023, green bars there, and then for 2024, back down a little bit, getting closer to those pre-pandemic levels. So the labor market's loosening up a little bit. Vacancies are about the same in the summer of 2024 as the summer of 2023, up 3%. There's a little volatility in there. It's about the same. There were roughly 1.1 unemployed persons per vacancy in the summer of 2024. That's about the same as one unemployed person per vacancy in the summer of 2023. And that may sound like a good balance, one unemployed person per vacancy, but we saw that some industries are down over the year, and that's where your unemployed people are coming from. And if you lose a job in an industry that's declining, and that's where your skill set is, you could have a hard time finding a job, even though it's a relatively tight labor market and there are enough vacancies to cover the unemployed people. So sometimes there's a skills mismatch, and people can have a hard time finding a job, even in a tight labor market. Labor supply going forward. So retirements are a big deal there. Retirements were up 5% since 2019 and rose by 26% over the past decade. And that's elevated retirements is expected to be ongoing for the next 10, 15 years. In other reasons there, though, one thing that we should talk about with labor supply is childcare. And with more and affordable childcare, we can help get some people into the labor market and help that labor supply. This is population growth. So these are annual averages for the years that are on the bottom scale. Oregon and Lane County may have lost some advantage as an attractor. So we're watching net migration very closely because you can see natural increase is down. So we're having more deaths than births. And so we're dependent on net migration to grow the labor force. So we're watching it very closely. And so 2,000 on average between 2020 and 2023 is not that bad. It's similar to what we had in 2000 to 2010. The Great Recession happened during that period, but we had a recession in 2020 also. So 2,000 is not that bad considering that there was a recession in that time period. Again, we'll be watching immigration over in the upcoming years. Lane County might have a little bit of an advantage there with the University of Oregon. We bring in a lot of people. Not everybody can say stay, but some people do. Either way, though, slower population growth will continue to tighten the labor market. Okay, so now we can take a look at some of the characteristics of the labor force. So our workforce is less diverse than the nation, especially with Black and African American, 2% compared to 13%, and the Hispanic and Latino ethnicity, we're at 12% compared to 21% for the United States. But the workforce is diversifying rapidly in recent years. This is 2001 to 2023, and you can see that the Latino Hispanic ethnicity has grown rapidly, but all minorities have grown over that time period. White is down a little bit. So, so we're seeing some diversification of the workforce. I have U.S. unemployment rates for the fourth quarter of 2024 over here. When you start looking at unemployment rates by race, the error range gets very large. So locally and even at the state, the error range is such that, you have to take it with a grain of salt. So that's why I used U.S. unemployment rates. So white and Asian are generally the lowest, and that's been going on for quite a while. Hispanic, Latino ethnicity up a little bit compared to that, and then Black or African American a little higher still.
Do you want questions as we go, or?
Let them finish.
We're going to wait till the end for?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. housing affordability. So first, we'll look at income. That's one side of housing affordability. And this is per capita income as a percent of the United States. And for Lane County, it's been improving over the past decade. We're at about 80% of the U.S., and that's climbed to about 90%. Compared to Oregon, we're down a little bit. Wages in Lane County are a little lower than Oregon in the United States. And also, we have a slightly higher percentage of retirees in Lane County compared to the nation and Oregon. So some of our income is transfer payments, especially Social Security. And so those are a couple of reasons that our per capita income is lower. Median housing value, the green bar or the green line up here is Lane County's median housing value. So housing costs have risen, particularly at the affordable end. The black line is U.S., so, you know, we've created some separation there. But what has really increased rapidly is this bottom third of housing values, more affordable housing. It's really kind of separated from the U.S. here over the past several years. So, you know, higher medium housing values, slightly lower income, housing affordability is an issue. There may be some help on the way. Residential building permits are up in 2024. And that last bar on the right, 2024, is through November. So there's going to be some addition to that. It takes about 1,400 units to keep up with population growth. And we've done that 3 of the past 4 years. You know, at least we're doing a lot better than coming out of the Great Recession as far as building permits and keeping up with population growth. It's probably, if population growth slows, then that 1,400 units number will come down also. So maybe we'll see more affordable housing going forward. Urban-rural comparison. So this is average annual wage. So rural Lane has less annual average wage than urban Lane. And for this analysis, urban is considered anything within the Eugene and Springfield urban growth boundaries. So average wage in urban Lane County is a little higher than rural, and Oregon is higher than urban Lane County. When we look at the industry concentration compared to urban and rural, first of all, 19% of all jobs are outside the urban growth boundaries of Eugene and Springfield. And, you know, if we look at the concentration for the rural area, it's blue collar, manufacturing, construction, transportation, warehousing, natural resources. That transportation and natural resources, a lot of that has to do with logging, but also agriculture. So, you know that's there's a definite difference there. Urban area, we have more management of companies, technical jobs, as you'd kind of expect. Unemployment rates are usually higher in rural areas, but not always. If we look at the cities in Lane County, Cottage Grove is a little higher than Eugene and Springfield. Florence is a little higher, and I think Oak Ridge has one of the higher unemployment rates. So it's kind of more your isolation. Cottage Grove has a large, dependable employer. So there are some rural areas that have low unemployment rates. Harney County out in eastern Oregon is an example. Everybody's retired, very small labor force. They got some jobs. I think they grew by 300 jobs over the year, and their unemployment rate is now 3%. So it happens sometimes in rural areas that with that small labor force and they get some jobs, they get very low unemployment rates. And projections, these were just published a few weeks ago. First of all, this is last year's Oregon Economic Analysis baseline forecast. So the baseline forecast is for soft landing. They have a new forecast this year. It looks pretty much the same. A lot of economists would argue that we have achieved that soft landing because we're still getting employment growth. We didn't go into a recession after raising interest rates. So we raised interest rates. When you do that, a lot of times it sends you into a recession. That's what that boom bust line would be. But we've achieved, we're lowering interest rates. Inflation is reasonable, and we still have employment growth. These are Lane County projections. Jobs are projected to increase by 7% by 2033. And we have construction, these are sorted by percentage growth. So we have construction growing the fastest. I mentioned before that there's money coming down from the federal government and state government for things like infrastructure and affordable housing. So we would expect that to increase the construction numbers. Sometimes it takes a while for that money to be spent, and so we're expecting over the next 10 years, though, that's going to help. Private education and health service, a lot of demand for health services. That's adding the most jobs, and it's second in percentage growth. Leisure and hospitality, we feel like there's still a little recovery for leisure and hospitality from the pandemic. But all other industries we feel have recovered from the pandemic as much as they're going to. Professional and business services, there's a lot of tech in there. Internet security is helping to drive that. Manufacturing, for Lane County, over the past 10 years, we've had pretty good manufacturing growth. And a lot of it was from food and beverage, but also surprisingly to some, wood products manufacturing had steady growth over the period, over the past decade, and added, I think, about 1,400 jobs over the past decade. In Lane County, we have plywood and engineered wood products, and Oregon has a little bit of a competitive advantage there compared to other areas. That's been doing well. The basic point here is that all industries are expected to add jobs. In state, local, and federal government, I added a little bit in there for fire suppression. Statewide, federal government is down a little bit because I think we're expecting to lose some in the Postal Service and some more efficiency in federal government. But we're at least breaking even there, and part of that's because there's some fire suppression employment added in. Oregon statewide is expected to increase by 8%, so we're a little bit slower than Oregon statewide. This is the industry projections in a little more detail, but we've included replacement openings. So the gold bar are growth openings, net growth, and that's what we saw in the previous graph. Replacement openings are created in two ways. There are exits, and that's when somebody leaves the labor force. It's largely from retirements. And then there's transfers, and that's when somebody makes a major occupational change. So it's not churn, which would be, say, a cashier at Walmart takes a job as a cashier at Target because it pays more or something. That's just regular churn. But if that cashier at Walmart completes their college degree and becomes a nuclear physicist or whatever their degree was in, that's a major occupational change, and that creates a replacement opening. So the point here is that replacement openings create a lot of opportunity going forward. And that's it for the numbers. The QR code, we have a survey going on, customer satisfaction survey. There's my contact information and our subscription service. So questions?
Great, Mr. Rennie, thank you for that presentation. I know Commissioner Trieger has some questions, so why don't you lead off?
Thank you. Let's see, out of order now without the slides up. Well, the first, just curious, the race and ethnicity in the workforce. Do you have that data by sector?
Yes, we can do that by sector. Let's see if I can. Yeah, we can do that by sector. I would have to look at the error range because once you start, especially at the county level.
Yeah.
We could go up another level, state or even national, and maybe get some idea from that also. But we can take a look.
And then similarly, by gender, employment, workforce diversity by gender and then by sector would be really interesting to me
Yes,
to see.
yeah, I believe we have that also.
I think that we'll see a pretty strong correlation between industries with lower wages and certain
Yes, I think
shift.
that's been improving somewhat.
And then thank you for the comment about needing more childcare workforce and resources so more people can get to work. And which sector includes the childcare workforce? Is it considered private education? Which, wasn't sure where that fits in the.
That's a good question. Industries.
Fourth from the bottom is private education and health?
Yeah, some of it would be there. Yeah, some of it's there, like Head Start is in there.
That wouldn't be government?
No, it's a nonprofit. So, yes, a lot of it's in private education, but I don't think all of it. I think some of it might be in the professional and business services also, just strictly private.
And that would carry through, so in the replacement opportunity slide, it would also be that same sector, if it,
Yes.
once it's in a sector. Okay, great, thank you. And then my last question, I don't know if you can answer this, partly because it's awfully early, and I don't know how this might be determined, but is there any discussion about the impacts that these devastating fires in California might have on construction workforce shortages going forward? Because there will be a huge need, and we're a neighboring state, and I am wondering if you have any ideas about it.
Yeah, labor availability in construction, it's an issue already.
Right.
But, yeah, that could have an effect. I know I used to work in construction, and there was a hurricane in South Carolina, and a lot of people went down there to help in the recovery just because it was high pay. So, yeah, that's a good point, and that's likely to happen.
Yeah, we could just cross over as we're about to start making more investments, particularly in housing development with that rebuild effort.
point.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, I'll call that good. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Commissioner Farr.
Thank you, Mr. Rooney. Always good to see you. You always have good news and mixed news and not so good news. More to the good side this time, it seems.
Yeah.
A little bit optimistic.
Yeah.
I'm going to base my questions more on comments and quotes from you, and just underscore some of the things that you said and make sure that I got the quote right, because these are words I'm going to repeat. And not surprisingly, one of the first things that Commissioner Trieger pointed out is one of the first things I'll point out. You said that one thing we should talk about is childcare. That's a quote. If we can get more resources into childcare, we can provide more services, free up labor market, and address a number of important issues. That's kind of a paraphrasing of your quotes. So the importance of childcare goes across all efforts that we make, and making certain that the people who are in the labor market or wish to be in the labor market have childcare available to them. But also childcare can be potentially a major employer if we are able to provide the facilities, support the facilities, and make sure that their living wages are being paid to the childcare workers. So.
Yes.
Good. I just wanted to make sure that I was in the right target. So if I talk about that every single meeting that we have from now on, it's okay because you just gave me authority. Excellent. Are we on that, Commissioner Trieger? One employed person per vacancy may seem like a good balance, but if you lose a job in your industry or your sector, you may have trouble, if it's a declining sector, you may have trouble finding work. We're experiencing that across the board, and a lot of times it's people who are credentialed in their particular sector that lose work, and they're having difficulty finding work. We experience that, and I see people on a regular basis. Right. You also said our labor market is dependent on in-migration for growth. I'd rather we be dependent on education of the existent population than in-migration, and making certain that we have the ways to make our labor force that's existent here capable of handling the jobs that are open here, so we don't have to go out of the market. Because coming into Eugene, another point you made is housing. We need 1,400 units a year. Did you say 1,400 a year to keep up with growth? Well, we're not making 1,400. You said we did in the last couple of 3 years, but generally speaking, we're not making 1,400, and that doesn't count those tents that are out, that we see out the window right there.
Right.
So it underscores the importance of housing and making certain that if we are going to have in-migration and satisfy the what is a kind of an equilibrium in births versus deaths locally, the organic growth, then we have to have more housing than we're producing. That has to happen. And then the one last thing that you stated was that a quote regarding Oak Ridge has a large unemployment rate. Cottage Grove has a large dependable employer. Therefore, it doesn't have a large.
It's a little bit higher than the countywide down in Cottage Grove.
But not as high as Oak Ridge, because Cottage Grove
Right.
has a large dependable. Those are bullet points. Those are exclamation points for me. Okay, thank you. I'll turn it over to other people, but you've confirmed some of the things that I thought I heard. I've took pictures and I wrote down quotes. Thank you, Mr.
Okay, sure.
Ryan, would you mind sliding your microphone towards you a little bit more? Getting the thumbs down signal on the sound, but you're doing well.
Okay.
Any other questions for Mr. Rooney? Yes, Vice Chair.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Rooney. If I'm understanding some of your slides correct, construction job growth is projected to go up 14%,
Yes,
but we lost jobs in construction.
over the past year. And that's what I was saying. I was surprised about that.
Yeah.
But
What do you, like, directly attribute?
part of the reason for the growth in the projection is because there's money coming down from the federal government and state government for infrastructure and affordable housing. And that money doesn't get spent immediately. It takes a while for that government money to come down and permitting and administration. So we're expecting that within that 10-year timeframe, that money that's coming down for infrastructure, affordable housing, and even the CHIPS Act is going to help grow construction.
We're kind of in that projected lag time.
Yeah, yes.
Anyone else? I have just one question. Maybe it might be slide into two, but it seems to me like our construction, our health fields, occupations, and our childcare is really something we should be, as a county, putting our needle on to move the needle as far as helping the job market overall. The question that I do have, though, in my particular district of Springfield District 2 is there's a very high percentage of self-employment. And I'm wondering, the self-employment growth graphs up there weren't as robust as maybe I would have liked to seen. Are you seeing systematically, culturally over the nation that our self-employment numbers are going down, or how are they faring?
Well, in the short term, in the pandemic, there was a lot of self-employment created. People were figuring out how to make money online. They were doing Lyft and Uber. But that's backed off a little bit. So we're expecting to see growth there. But in the short term, we're seeing some back off from the creation of self-employment.
People had to invent life hacks, what you're saying.
Right,
Exactly
right, in 2020, 2021. And yeah, that carried over from the pandemic into post-pandemic, but kind of slowed down as people got back into more traditional jobs.
Right. All right. Anyone else? Any other comments? Mr. Rooney, thank you very much, sir. Very well done.
you.
Appreciate you very much. Our next item on our agenda is our legislative update from our very own Policy Director, Steve Adams. Take it away, Steve.
Chair, Vice Chair, Commissioners, colleagues, thanks so much for the opportunity to present on the state and federal outlook. As we convene today to begin the process for the next budget cycle for the County of Lane, there are certainly federal and state factors to keep in mind. We have a presidential transition in progress. Mr. Trump will be inaugurated on Monday, and the outgoing Biden administration continues to work until its final hours to move dollars out from the last two sessions of Congress. So there is a very active federal activity underway right now. It was a very closely fought election in 2024. We have something like a 16 or 18-month election cycle now at the federal level for presidential elections, and there was a lot of uncertainty going into this election, and certainly the results were. There's a lot of prognostication out there and a lot of kind of afterburning on why the results landed as they were, but one of the kind of overarching messages that seems to be out there in the analysis is an affordability crisis. So many Americans felt very pinched by the inflation pressures nationally that we saw. You saw that certainly in the way in which campaigns were run, and it continues to be a focus moving forward. Here in the state of Oregon, and as we heard from Mr. Rooney, our state revenue forecasts and our state economic forecasts continue to be pretty robust. Wayne County is going into the 2025 long session with a very seasoned state delegation. In fact, our very own Representative Fahey has been unanimously elected by the caucus as Speaker of the House on the House side. And our other members are exceedingly well positioned to be extremely influential in how policy unfolds this year. The revenue forecast at the state level is fairly robust moving forward. The latest revenue forecast was the December 2024. At the state level, the forecast for the next biennium was $37.8 billion, and that was a net increase of $2.27 billion from the previous revenue forecast. So that's just in the general fund. And state government, as you know, is not unlike local government. We have 30 funds. State government has several funds as well. That's the general fund, and that plays a big role in what state government will be able to allocate. The pandemic and recovery era resources are washing through the state and local governments. We just had a major deadline for the American Recovery Plan Act. Dollars had to be allocated and obligated by December 31st of 2024. Any dollars that were not obligated at that point were reverting back to the United States Treasury. So that was a deadline for state and local governments who had received those dollars. We, of course, booked ours entirely, and so that was not responsive to us, but others out there may be. ARPA dollars, Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act dollars, and the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as the CHIPS Act that Mr. Rooney just mentioned, were major investments by the United States Congress in the last two sessions of Congress and have put a huge amount of money into the hands of state and local governments. We're seeing some reductions in that. The Infrastructure and Jobs Act, for instance, that was a $1.2 trillion program that expires in September of 26, so that will be federal fiscal year 26. There's 2 more years of funding in the pipeline for that, in which we'll continue to see some projects. As of December of the White House was reporting that $568 billion of that 1.2 was out the door. The rest will be tied up in fiscal 25 and fiscal 26 appropriations bills that we'll see to get to that. And then the Inflation Reduction Act was a 10-year package that the Congress at that time passed through reconciliation. And I'll speak a little bit more to that. Here in Oregon and in Salem, we certainly are seeing some degree of continuity in some of the priorities moving forward. The organizational session is done, committee assignments have been announced, and members get underway on Tuesday of next week to begin the procedures. The governor, in her budget recommendations, continues to focus specifically on the 3 priorities that she emphasized in coming into the 23 long session with houselessness and housing production. She's recommending $218 million for ongoing statewide shelter operations, another $188 million for rehousing efforts, and $173 million for prevention efforts. in addition to that, an additional just over $1 billion in housing production funds is what the governor is recommending in her budget. For mental health and addiction care, the total package really is $330 million in the governor's recommended budget. That is divided into workforce development issues, it supports, and just broader capacity, trying to increase the number of beds and treatment opportunities for our neighbors in need of care. The legislature will be prioritizing a transportation package. So we've long heard that 2025 was going to be the year that we would take up transportation again. We've not had a comprehensive package since 2017 in terms of funding. And we have heard much about the Oregon Department of Transportation, no acronyms, Chair, their budget shortfall, their revenue as they were going into this next biennium, they're looking at about a $350 million revenue shortfall. And this is driven in large measure because of declining revenues associated with gasoline taxes, which were not indexed to inflation, and the rapid increase in the cost of materials and personnel. So they're certainly facing a similar story that many state and local agencies are: higher materials and labor costs and flat revenue, or very, very modest declines. So we know we've got a very active caucus moving forward on transportation. The State Road Fund is, of course, 50% for state funds, 30% for counties, and 20% for cities as we go forward. And so what's happening at the state level is happening at the local level as well. And so there had been some concern, I think, earlier this year during the interim that there might be some kind of shifts from the local side to the state side to help cover some of the state level cost deficits, but I think there has been a concerted kind of voice that can't happen. So we certainly have challenges here, and certainly our Public Works Director can speak at length of this, and there is a very active conversation about what this might look like. We don't think we're going to see a bill until April about what the comprehensive fix is going to be, but I think most people are thinking there will be the beginning of a sequence of revenue raisers associated with new transportation. So that will be a topic to watch, and we'll be closely working on that. I think it's important for us to note that certainly we understand these priorities from the governor and from legislative leadership currently going into session, but we, I think, have to recognize that our legislature will be watching what the United States Congress is doing as well. And so the legislature's priorities may shift in real time as we see legislative action at the federal level. I think it's important to note that some of the challenges that we're seeing because of just where we are in this kind of pandemic recovery cycle, that federal inputs into state and local governments across the country are down, and many state and local governments around the country are coping with budget challenges. Oregon actually looks pretty good at the state level compared to many other states. All right, so one of the areas, our primary focus going into the 2025 session really will be focusing on those areas of shared state and local, particularly county government service delivery. There's a whole host of them. Counties are incorporated as part of the service delivery model in state government. So it's not only state agencies providing services to Oregonians, it's state agencies and counties providing shared services in a lot of different areas. So for us, as we go into the process in 2025, we will be focused on where the appropriation levels are being set for some of these pass-through dollars, as well as wanting to have conversations about broader policy questions about how formulas are set, or how other ways of service delivery and expectations for dollars are being captured at the agency level. So we see in the governor's budget, we have several key areas. The governor is recommended the Community Corrections Act at $342 million for the next biennium. And we're seeing the kind of head counts associated with the way that those funds are being allocated to counties come up. So that will be helpful to our broader public service system here. We're seeing an increase in the governor's budget of 10% for the Oregon Youth Authority. And of course, we have pass-through dollars that come through to service deliveries that we provide through county government as well, and community justice and rehab services. And we're even seeing $70 million for the Justice Reinvestment Initiative, which is an increase from what we've seen in the past. Behavioral health deflection in the governor's budget. So this was the almost singular focus of the 24 short session. The governor's recommending a $40 million investment moving forward. That's pretty much a flat rate of what we got from this last year. It was a one-year investment. Now it will become a two-year biennial investment. And so I think there will be some conversation there about what the community of practice of counties has learned over the past year in standing up deflection, and the ability and potential creativity of interweaving that with housing and other kinds of supports that the Lane County Behavioral Health Deflection Program has really pioneered. Getting better results for the dollar, I think, is something that will be critical. We will be focused on, in our assessment and taxation function, our CAFA grant, which is the county assistance for financial something.
It's County Assistance Function Funding.
Thank you. Thank you so that historically was about 30% of our total budget for our programs. In recent years, that's down to about 11%. So we've seen an erosion at the state level of support. Our own assessor and tax collector has become rapidly a thought leader in state conversations in the legislature about how to revisit that. In our health and human services area, we're very focused on some shared services. Public health modernization is going to be an area of focus as we see budgets come forward and we see the disaggregation. Our behavioral health service model, particularly through our CFAA and County Financial Assistance Agreement.
Thank you for expanding that acronym.
Yes, indeed. I'm trying. That is an area, of course, where the expansion of services for local behavioral health authorities has grown at a rate that outpaces the level of investment that we've seen from state government. And so really trying to right-size the scales there is a key priority. And again, systems reinvention is a key kind of component of that. And then in the short session, we were able to receive a one-time appropriation for child family health assistance, which previously had been a match for county government and a great assistance to us. That's an area, there's ongoing conversations and a broader suite of programs for child and family health. That's something I think we will want to watch as well. All right, and then what's happening in the United States Congress? So the 119th Congress is in session and working actively. The United States Senate is taking up confirmations that have already been put forward by the President-elect Trump, and they are not scheduled to go out of session until well into March. We have work ahead of us on the 1st of January of 2025. The debt ceiling legislation expired, so Congress now the administration is in the process of doing the extraordinary measures at Treasury to make sure that we can continue to pay our bills, but we will need to see legislation move soon, and so that will be a priority. We had a continuing resolution passed that kept the government open in December of 2024, on the 20th, just before the holidays. And that goes through March 14th of 2025. So we have not yet passed the federal fiscal 2025 Appropriations Acts, and that will need to move forward. So we're anticipating work on that. It is quite likely that in taking up the 2025 budget, Congress will use the budget reconciliation process, which enables Congress to address some degrees of substantive legislation that has budget implications and enables them to, the majority party, to get through the Senate with a mere majority, not having to get to the 60 level cloture rule for filibuster proofing. So we are anticipating that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act from 2017 will likely be a component of the reconciliation process come March. And as we're just trying to pay attention to see what will be proposed, we're trying to understand what they will need to do for quote-unquote pay-fors, right? So you have to offset any sort of revenue reduction with other kinds of expenditures. And so that's the conversation that is happening right now in the House Budget Committee. So we're watching and we're seeing what is being, so it's all just kind of speculation at this point. And I think the very narrow majority in both the House and the Senate will be challenging for members to really, and for congressional leadership to make things move. At the present, until about April, the House really only has a margin of 2 votes in terms of the majority versus the minority. So it's going to be a knife's edge to get some of this done. We are seeing in some of the early ideas, President Trump has indicated that Social Security and Medicaid or Medicare are off the table for any sort of expenditures. So the largest kind of entitlement that remains available is Medicaid funding. And so there are some proposals out there to look at making Medicaid work for the most vulnerable and reimagining the Affordable Care Act are some of the ideas that are being out there. Our team is looking at these, and we know state government is as well. This will have implications potentially for the Oregon Health Plan, and we'll have to monitor this as we go. At this point, we don't have enough to go on. We'll need to see more language. And this board has made, I think, a very wise decision to invest in federal lobbying support. We'll be working with our federal lobbyists to really understand what's happening there. I would note that this reconciliation process is likely going to happen again for the federal 2026 process. So if you remember back in the 2017 session of Congress, we had the same set of circumstances. We had an incoming administration and a Congress that had not completed the appropriations process for the year prior. So there was actually kind of 2 bites at the apple for the reconciliation process. So we don't know what they will be looking at specifically, but certainly I think there is a lot of pressure to reduce federal level spending. So we need to monitor that. What we do understand so far, and as our lobby team in DC is telling us, we think congressionally directed spending will continue in the new session of Congress, that there's support in both House and Senate appropriations leadership for ongoing. So we will continue to work with department directors and with the board to identify projects to put forward. Just as a simple logistical front activity, we are planning our 2025 visit to DC in April. So those are the dates that we have agreed. Chair, that is what I have for you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Adams. Is there any questions or comments for Steve? It's a lot to take in. 2 bites of the apple and the rest of it as well, as you would say, yeah? Yes, Commissioner Ford.
Thank you, Chair. Steve, Mr. Adams, thanks for the hard work you do and the work you're doing with Vanessa Cornwall, who I'm very impressed with Vanessa's initial work, stepping out and really engaging at a really high level. Looking forward to this legislative session because of our strong presence that I anticipate. I just want to make sure that there's only one thing that I wanted to point out, and that you said the governor's 3 priorities remain intact. And Lane County has been and is well positioned to work with the governor in her 3 main priorities. It's something that we've done. In fact, we've more or less led the way on all 36 Oregon counties. We've been the leading county in addressing the governor's priorities. So we're looking forward to that, and our team remains intact, and our committees remain intact. So I believe that supporting what Governor Kotek has put forward as her priorities is something that we're well prepared to do. So I just want to mention that Mr. Adams has been a really powerful force in his short tenure. You've only been here with us for 4 years now, and it's amazing the impact that you've made, Steve. Thank you for all the work that you do.
You're very generous, Commissioner. Thank you.
Yes, Commissioner Trieger.
Thank you. Thank you, as always, for all the information. I'm going to start with the federal level and then ask a question at the state level. And this is, and I just want to note the outgoing administration. I think for the first time we have a president and vice president who both started at the county government level, right? Vice president as a deputy DA once upon a time for, I don't remember which county, but President Biden was a county commissioner, was his first elected office, if people didn't know that, in Newcastle County, Delaware. And some of us had the good fortune to hear him speak to the NACO conference, the National Association of Counties last year. So, so I guess my question is, if you've seen any indication of policies or policy concepts at the federal level or proposals that would affect this, the economic pessimism that you talked about voters having, and address affordability specifically at the county level. I haven't yet heard anything, and in particular, right, there's been a recent action that actually goes completely against that with the lack of the Secure Rural Schools funding being reauthorized. So anything you've heard that maybe I might be missing that would indicate this incoming administration understands the needs of counties?
Chair, Commissioner, it's a good question. I think that in the case of Secure Rural Schools, that did pass the Senate. It did not make it through the House, and there was it was a bit tough to get out of the last session right before Christmas with the working majority. I think there was some hope that SRS authorization would have gotten picked up, and that would have carried us with the expiration from 23 to 26 is what that would have done. So it would have added 3 more years of funding, and our funding comes to us with one year lag, and Christine can speak to this so much better than I can. So that is one example that we think there is probably bipartisan support for that, given that constituency. I think we will see a number of investments continuing in areas. I think infrastructure more broadly is something that during the first term, Mr. Trump was very focused on infrastructure and spoke about it often. And I think over the last couple of sessions of Congress, I think we have created some pathways to enable new infrastructure at levels that we haven't seen happen. So there will be, and there's funds authorized for that. That said, the kind of overarching concern about federal debt levels and federal expenditures as being as pressing inflation will be a challenge. And certainly we just got new inflation numbers out for December. December inflation was back up a bit. And this creates some challenges for the Federal Reserve as they try to manage monetary policy and keep inflation down. So I think there will be voices in Congress calling for austerity, calling for some expenditure reductions in large measure to try to address ongoing inflation. Whilst we will see many of the Inflation Reduction Act and Infrastructure and Jobs Act funds, the majority of those dollars went into districts represented by members from the Republican side of the House. And so there will be a lot of folks who will not want to see some of those investments moving forward. So with a very tight margin on the House side, this is going to be really difficult for Mr. Johnson to manage. I really do not envy the kind of knife's edge they have to strike on the federal side.
Great, thank you for that. And then at the state level, I think I know the answer to this, but I have to ask it. I appreciate you talking about a focus on working with members about how formulas are set, rather than talking about this particular bucket of money for this particular program. I think that is so important because there's so much that's just upside down, particularly as you mentioned in Community Justice Reinvestment Act funding. The state road fund, though, Is there any hope or discussion about how the percentage split, how that pie is divided up, and talk about making it more equitable to reflect the road miles that different levels of jurisdiction are responsible for? Because it's not quite divided up the right way, if that's the formula.
Chair and Commissioner, indeed, counties, while getting 30% of the money, has the majority of actual road miles. And so that kind of disparity, and the fact that we've historically funded this through federal timber payments, right? So that business model is very different. We have electric vehicles coming online. Cars are much more gasoline efficient than they ever were. So that kind of model that we're using, the debate right now is how do we come up, and I think so much of the focus is on the actual revenue generation model. So there's a lot of conversation about vehicle miles traveled kinds of ways of paying for it. So the weight of your car times the number of miles you travel, regardless of how you whether you're electric or gasoline, would in fact be a way for you to contribute your fair share. And I think we continue to see some conversations at the state level about whether or not counties and cities are really tapping into all of the revenue sources that are available at this level of government. I appreciate that, and that really is a perspective of the relative political will of each of the governing levels. At the end of the day, we're all talking about the same Oregonians, right? So to the extent that you're paying the state versus the local versus the city, those are all conversations that we probably have to have. I think ultimately, Commissioner, some of this might in fact be building towards really thinking about Oregon's business model more broadly. It's curious that we see very robust revenue growth continue at the state level, but we see, the opposite at local levels of government, right? And so the way in which we collect revenue and the way in which it's allocated, I think continues to be one of the largest conversations in the room. And I think that's multiple sessions to get us there.
Thank you. I don't want to stray us too far from Lane County's budget kickoff, but I just want to say that's really useful and appreciate that to think about in conversations with our state legislators, because the vehicle miles traveled, of course, is not necessarily an equitable solution. We just saw from our budget forecast about folks in rural communities having lower wages and more challenges, and they have to travel more miles to get to basic services. So, and of course, it's also not equitable to share the burden across individual residential vehicle miles traveled versus, say, large multi-state or even international corporations using our roads to benefit their bottom line. So appreciate that. That's helpful. Thank you.
Any other comments for our esteemed policy director, Mr. Adams? If not, thank you very much, Steve. Appreciate your time very much. Next, we'll move on to our county overview and history from our own county administrator, Steve Mokrajewski. Take it away.
Thank you, Chair, Commissioners, department leadership, staff that's in the room, and others who are watching this webcast. Good morning. We structured today's budget kickoff as sort of a nuts and bolts. So you had a couple presentations here that are high level, local and state, the relative health of our local and state economy, what's happening at the state and federal level. These are all really important elements to understand as we start thinking about setting our budget and the financial challenges that we face here in Lane County. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the timeline and process, get into the history. So we're going to spend a little more time this year talking about some of the history of how we ended up where we're at. Sometimes we skip over some of that and answering that why. Why are we in this situation? Why do we have financial constraints in Lane County? Why are Lane County's financial constraints different than other counties in Oregon? Is an important question to answer so that we can understand the context with the challenges that we're dealing with today. And then Christine will walk through, we'll sort of narrow the conversation as we go through this to talk about, again, the history, some of the challenges we face, particularly in the general fund and some of our other distressed funds. So you'll see here, this is sort of a timeline. It shows today as our kickoff meeting. Truth be told, we've been working on various elements of developing our budget for several months now. That's different than we typically do. We typically do really have our kickoff meeting here, and then we begin the process with departments. We'll talk a little bit as we go through this presentation, the work that we've been doing with departments, particularly in our central service areas, to begin having conversations about looking at ways in which we can align our budgets, align our revenues and expenses, and identify some expenditure reductions. So you see here, again, our leadership kickoff, budget kickoff today. We'll then move to a department budget kickoff. So we'll meet with all of our department budget staff, many of whom are here in the room. By late February, departments will be submitting their department budgets. So we provide direction to all the departments on how we want them to submit their budget, different guidance on expectations that we have around around how they enter their revenues and expenses. And again, our departments really understand the revenues and expenses that they collect better than anyone. And so once we get that picture and we see what departments are projecting for next year, it gives us a better picture of where we'll sit next fiscal year. So that process is really important to have departments submit their budget requests. We then will, in March, move into conversations with departments where the county administrators, the budget officer, and the budget and financial planning team will meet with each department to talk about how their budget is shaping up and to look at any adjustments that need to be made to bring those budgets in line. Late April, the county administrator will finalize and propose the budget. That's the county administrator's role as the budget officer, is to do all of that work along with our teams in our departments and our staff to pull all that information together, develop a proposed budget, and then submit it to the budget committee, which of course comprises the 5 commissioners and 5 appointed residents in our community. The budget committee meetings then of those 10 individuals, as well as all of our department leadership and staff, will happen in early to mid-May. The budget committee will approve the budget. They make any adjustments they deem necessary, approve the budget, and move it forward to the Board of Commissioners. And in mid-June, the Board of Commissioners will adopt the budget before the fiscal year begins July 1st. So this is a real quick snapshot. We're going to show you some graphs here to give you a picture of what we're dealing with. But this is the current fiscal year that we're in, represents over 2,085 full-time equivalent positions. So we have, some full-time positions, some part-time positions, extra help. We add up all of those positions together. We call that FTE. The full-time equivalent positions that we have are 2,085.9 positions in the organization. $1.2 billion annual budget. Important to note here, I say this in the past, and I may sound like a broken record, but I'm going to repeat a lot of things because understanding these elements is really important as we deal with the context of the challenges we face. Approximately 60% of the revenue that Lane County collects comes from state and federal government. So Mr. Adams talked about it, as we talk about monitoring what the state is doing with its resources, what the federal government is doing with its resources, is critically important to Lane County. It's not just we don't pay attention to these things for the theater aspect. We pay attention to these elements from the standpoint that they affect our organization and the public that we serve every day because the resources we rely on, heavily reliant on state and federal dollars. If you look at city governments, that's not true. There's much more of a reliance on local taxes and fees than there is state and federal dollars. But counties tend to rely particularly on state resources as an arm of the state. And in Lane County, we have a significant amount of state and federal revenue. So 60% state and federal funds, 40% local taxes and fees. And then you see the departments that we have here in Lane County that are represented at the table. And we'll talk about all these things. This chart here shows you the growth in positions, the growth in FTE, full-time equivalent positions in Lane County over the past 10 years. It is a fact that our budget has grown in the past 10 years significantly. Largely, it grows from a local tax and fee standpoint because our revenue grows each year. We project about 3.5% property tax growth each year. It also has grown, the largest growth really has happened in those areas where we've received additional state and federal dollars. And so we'll dive into that chart here. When you see this, this chart that shows you by category, the different categories of services that we provide. So what we've done here is lump in public health and welfare across all funds in Lane County. The positions that are focused on public health and welfare, positions focused on public safety, positions focused on general government services. Those include areas like assessment and taxation, elections, as well as administration and finance and budget and human resources and technology and all of those areas. Culture and recreation, community development, and then public roads and infrastructure. So those are the categories, and then we show fiscal year 14-15, 10 years ago, to fiscal year 24-25. The growth, so you get to see in these categories the growth in FTE. Let's set aside the culture recreation growth. That's about a 60% growth. It's, you know, it is largely because we had the Parks Levy that provided an infusion of resources in an area that was very few FTE. So it grew significantly as a result of that Parks levy being adopted by voters a couple years ago. Community development additionally grew significantly as part of the Holiday Farm Fire response and recovery, and we have kept that growth and subsidized that growth largely through some one-time resources as well as video lottery funds to support the growth in community development, to be able to meet the needs in the community, particularly around wildfire recovery and additional construction and growth. And I'd like to focus, you know, particularly on the public health and welfare, public safety, general government categories, and also touch on roads and infrastructure. The public health and welfare has grown approximately 45% over the last 10 years. That growth has largely happened in the areas of community health centers because of Medicaid expansion, where we've seen, we've grown our clinics from 2 to now 9. We have 9 clinics that Lane County operates. And so we've seen a significant expansion and growth in our, in the positions that we've created and hired to be able to meet that need. In addition, so that's federal pass-through funding, mostly Medicaid funding that passes through the state. In developmental disabilities, we've seen significant expansion and growth in revenue that is provided from the state government to Lane County to provide developmental disabilities services. So we've seen a significant growth in FTE there. And in public health, additionally, we've seen a lot of growth in the public health area. And Eve can talk more about this. And I would invite any of our department leadership to add to the comments. If you have anything that you want to add, please do that. Public health, through public health modernization, as well as through the pandemic years, the growth in state and federal dollars for those services. We've also seen a 27% increase in public safety. Those have come sort of spread out in areas in the sheriff's office, district attorney's office, youth services, parole and probation over those years. General government has grown about 21%. So as a whole, we've grown, if we look at all areas in Lane County, our FTE have grown about 44% over the past 10 years. And important to note, in those general government categories, we've grown slower, right? So if we're growing at 44% as a whole, general government and public safety are growing at a lower rate than some of the other areas. Roads and infrastructure has grown the least amount at 4%. Some of that may not be completely surprising because a lot of the costs that that are wrapped up in the work that we do there are not just in labor, but they're also in materials and equipment. But it's also, I think, important to note that we've seen very low growth in that area. So this, again, just gives you a picture of, yes, our budget has grown and our FTE have grown, and that's a good thing because we've been able to capture additional resources, largely from the state and federal government, that are focused in some particular areas. So we've seen growth in some of those particular areas that I mentioned. And I'm going to touch as we go through here on the significant decline we've seen over decades in particular areas, particularly in public safety and general government services in Lane County. So the growth that you've seen in the last 10 years, while positive, does not make up for the significant reduction that happened prior to these 10 years in those areas, okay? So this is a busy chart. What I just want to point out here is this reflects all of our funds in Lane County. An important point to note, anytime we talk about our budget, we talk about it as one thing, and we have a document, this big document, we say this is Lane County's budget. It is really a collection of many different parts. Try to think about an analogy. In the private sector, you might think of a company, and this is a bad comparison, but just to give you a relative example, a conglomerate organization, like a Berkshire Hathaway, right? That holds a lot of different businesses and industries, right? That don't necessarily neatly fit under one industry category, but that is hugely complex and diverse. And that is Lane County. We have this year 33 different funds. Each of those funds are unique. They receive revenue from unique places. Most of our funds require that the revenue that's received in those funds has to be spent within those funds, so it's restricted. The general fund is the one example, and you see the carve out here of the pie cutout is the general fund. It is the one of our 33 funds that has discretion to it. The board, because it is where the property tax revenue goes. So the Board of Commissioners has really wide discretion on how you can spend the general fund resources. Historically, counties in Oregon and across the country spend their general fund resources on areas that are sort of the basic services that counties were created to provide. Public safety, public health, and general government services. And we'll touch on those. So we can think about Lane County as the parent company in this conglomerate, and all of our departments, all of these different funds as subsidiaries, carrying out really critical, important services for the organization with funds that are oftentimes restricted in the way that they do them. And so when we talk about our budget, it's sometimes difficult because we talk about financial constraints. It's true that we have some funds that are structurally balanced, that are solvent, that are healthy, that have the revenue necessary to provide the services. It's also true that there are some really critical areas that are under-resourced and where revenue is not keeping pace with expenses, and that's the challenge that we're facing. So this chart, again, very busy, just a general point. I'm not going to go through all of this, but this takes us back, a solid 70 years to paint the picture of Lane County's reliance on timber funding. And it goes back to almost 90 years here. 1937, when the Oregon-California Act was passed, and it reflects in 1953, it shows counties received 75% of the timber harvest. Then in 1960, that declined. There was actually a voluntary limitation that was made. County said, we'll just collect 50% of that to be able to make investments in the federal lands to make them sustainable for harvest over time. Then in 1990, and you're going to see this, if this was a Hollywood movie, you couldn't script a perfect storm any more perfectly than this. In 1990, the North Spotted Owl gets listed on the threatened species endangered list and creates significant restrictions and reductions in logging on these lands. Then in 1994, and remember in 1990 is approximately when Measure 5 went into effect, right? So you get Measure 5, which restricts property tax collections by local governments, and at the same time you have the Spotted Owl gets listed. Then you have in 1994, the Northwest Forest Plan is enacted, and timber harvest immediately decreased by 82% in 1994. A year later, around this time, 94, 95, was measures 47 and 50, and I'll touch on those in a second. And then from 1994 to 2024, counties have received these safety net payments. They were originally called the OWL Guarantee, then they're called SRS. We no longer have SRS, as you heard from Mr. Adams, and we'll talk a little bit about that history. So currently, we are at 50% timber harvest, and we'll show what those actual dollars mean relative to the past. But this is, again, just to paint this picture, this heavy reliance on timber fundings, both from ONC lands and U.S. forest lands. Okay. Another busy chart. So, but this shows you ONC federal timber revenues going back to 1974. This is a trip down memory lane. So 1974 to 2013. And what this, to me, shows is the volatility, even before. So sometimes we do talk about timber revenue is the, we like to sort of just say things are black and white. And well, if we could just get back to this place of, you can see that even in the mid-'80s, before the spotted owl was listed, before the statewide property taxes were put in place, there was this volatility, a significant drop. It's never a good thing for government to rely, for any government, particularly local government, to rely so heavily on a volatile revenue source to fund such critical services like public safety and infrastructure maintenance. And you see that happen here. So can you kind of see my marker here? This is like 83 where we see the significant decline, and then it starts jumping back up. And this is right around where this was the OWL Guarantee. So we start to see the declines here with the Northwest Forest Plan here, and then the OWL Guarantee, and then here you see the Secure Rural Schools entitlement payments come in, and this creates some greater stability. But then what happens with these federal entitlement dollars over time, Congress loses interest and says, well, this isn't really our place, and so you see this steep decline. This is 2013, and I'll show a chart that shows us down today, like further down here. So, this is the history. And again, this is just the revenue that the general fund received, right? This doesn't show the road fund, which is U.S. Forest Service. Okay, again, I'm not going to go through this. We have some busy slides here, but the history is important. So this is all available for folks to review, but this talks about pre-Measure 5, local governments, local taxing districts calculated their own tax levy, and it was limited to 6% annual growth. So today, we estimate 3.5% because there's a cap under these measures that allows where growth is capped well below that 6%. But prior to the Measure 5, local governments had more control over their tax levies and greater growth until Measure 5 was approved. And so you can see Lane County fluctuated in the 80s to 90s between a 60-cent rate to a 91-cent rate. And we had additional levies that were passed for that. And then post Measure 5 and 47 and 50, you see these limitations that go into effect that ultimately put us at the $1.28 per thousand, a calculation that we're at for our permanent rate. That's what this shows here. So this shows all 36 counties in Oregon. Again, this is just supposed to be a snapshot to show you this is where Lane County fits, right? And who are we like? We're like Josephine, Curry, Coos, Douglas, and Lynn. You have to cross Deschutes out because actually they're probably up here when you look at their permanent rates. They have two permanent public safety rates that really put them more up to like a $3 rate. So don't consider them. So we're like, from a tax revenue, a property tax standpoint, Josephine, Coos, Curry, Douglas, and Lynn. Can someone explain to me what we have in common with those counties, other than the fact that we historically have relied on timber funding? From a population standpoint, from a geographic size, from a complexity, we have very little in common with those. They're wonderful counties, but we have very little in common with them. We have more in common from a likeness standpoint with Washington in terms of the size and the types of services we provide, with Clackamas, with Marion, and with Deschutes that really should be up here. And that's what this chart shows is, again, Deschutes, it shows them as $1.28, but they actually have this additional permanent rate of $1.25 countywide. Can you imagine if Lane County had an additional $1.25 rate, what we could do with that? And that helps to fund their public safety services. In addition to this rural rate, this helps fund the DA's office and corrections, and I think some parole and probation and 911 services. The rural rate helps to support rural patrols, recognizing that rural residents should pay for the patrol in those areas. City residents have their own law enforcement. Clackamas County also has an enhanced law enforcement rate of 72 cents, not reflected in their permanent rate here, and then they split their rate between city and county. It looks a little different there. So again, this shows that perfect storm. You know, we went off the cliff with the timber funding, and at the same time those property tax caps went into effect, we've been frozen in this artificially low property tax rate. We should have a higher rate, but we just missed it. Bad timing, I guess. Okay, and then here, this shows you, you know, sort of secure rural schools funding at around 2000 and into the current years, what SRS looked like. There's a lot of detail here that's really important detail. I'm not going to go through all of it. But this slide shows you, essentially gives you the snapshot picture of what that reflects. So it goes back to, this is around 2000, 2001, and then this goes to last fiscal year. And this shaded part here is inflation adjusted. So if we look back to 2001, the inflation adjusted numbers, and the light green shows general fund, dark green is road fund, what was received in these SRS payments. So this is post-timber. These are SRS guaranteed payments. You know, it was over $50 million inflation adjusted between those two funds. And then you just see today, now what we do is there is no SRS. An important point that I'll mention here in a moment is right around, where are we? 16, 17, Christine has it circled. Don't you? Yeah. I can't read it, but I think what it says is that this is around where, maybe that's not what this says, but
It's a timber harvest year.
it's a timber harvest year. But right around this time is when we made an intentional effort to say, we need to stop relying on SRS funds, these onesie, twosie. We don't know when Congress is going to get their act together. I mean, thankfully, we have great representatives in Congress that advocate for us, but as a whole, there's not a lot of interest in providing these payments to counties across the country, because there are very few counties that rely on those resources. So we said, we need to wean ourselves off of reliance on those SRS payments and just go down strictly to the timber receipts. And so that's what we've done budgetarily, is we've said, we only budget what we expect to receive, and that's what you see here. For the current fiscal year, we budgeted $3.7 million in O&C funding into the general fund, $1.4 million in U.S. Forest Service into the road fund. That's what we're budgeting now. So if we receive any additional payments, if Congress actually approves an SRS payment, we view that as one-time money. And what that ends up doing, I'm going to go back here, because what we did in 2021, I think it was, right around 2021, 3 or 4 years ago, we established these one-time patrol funds. We did them over 2 different years, and we took some of those resources from the SRS payments. We worked with the Sheriff's Office and Public Works, and we took a chunk of those resources that were originally dedicated for the road fund, and we said, you know, we really have this significant need and lack of patrols in rural areas, so we're gonna establish these 2 5-year, we called them they were kind of our internal levy funds, right? We've identified these federal dollars, put them into these funds, and I think one of them is scheduled to expire, and the sheriff can touch on this, at the end of this fiscal year. We think we may have a little bit extra time on that, but not much. The other one is set to expire at the end of next fiscal year. It was around $10 to $12 million total between those two that we set aside, and we funded a handful of additional FTE in patrol. And I think those were 6 to 8 FTE, Sheriff?
The second time around was 8 positions in patrol. The first time was 4, 2 in the McKenzie district and 2 on the West Lane.
So 12 total FTE between those two. That doesn't mean 12 total deputies on patrol at one time. As you know, a shift usually includes 3 to 4. So it was a very minimal in terms of service level and impact, but really important. And we felt like we needed to do that. But it's just, I want to put a pin in that to remind folks that those are funds that are scheduled to go away. They will be expended, and unless there's some additional SRS funding or other funding identified for those, that service will not be available within the next year to 2 years. Touch on briefly prior to fiscal year 13-14, what the county did, and there was this big drop off in SRS funding in 2012, and we'll show that here in a second. I am getting close to the end of my presentation, and we have, if you have some questions, and then a little bit of time for a break if you'd like, Chair. But the county, did things such as service reductions, hiring freezes, across the board cuts, things like prepaying the pension bond, freezing cost of living increases. We saw for several years, like a 7-year period of time, particularly for non-represented employees, there were no cost of living increases provided. There were limited cost of living increases for some represented groups during that time. So we saw really a slower growth in wages and expense and salaries during this period of time. That may have helped in some ways to further to create a dynamic where we would have further eroded services, but it also created a separate problem, which is make it really difficult to recruit and retain talent in the organization when your wages become depressed compared to the market. So that's been a focus that we've had in the last several years, is to try to catch up and get our positions more competitive so we can recruit and retain the best talent. Paid off debt early, so a lot of things were looked at. You can see there were a number of revenue task forces put in place. The board in this last year has created a public safety funding task force. That group continues to meet and is working on finalizing over the next few months, hopefully, recommendations on funding for public safety. Not an easy task to complete. The board did in 2006 implement an income tax, and that was then reversed by voters at the ballot. So a lot of efforts were made. This shows you kind of a timeline. So if we can take this more recent history from around the last 10, 11, 12 years, in 2012, we had this big drop off, $10 million general fund deficit. The county reduced 188 full-time equivalent positions. Today, if we did that today, on a percentage basis, it'd be about 270 positions across the organization. I can't imagine what that would look like today. And then in May of 2013, bright note, the passage of the public safety levy that really helped to sort of start to repair some of those broken public safety services. As we get to 2015, we really started to say, gosh, we've eroded some of these services. We've been forced to cut in some really critical areas. What we need to do is create some balance. We have to stop the bleeding and try to look at all the ways in which we can tighten our belts without impacting services and employment. We did a lot of things around focusing on a structural balance. We have to get away from our reliance on secure rural schools. We have to stop deficit spending, which means we're burning through our reserves every year. And those reserves, it's like spending your savings account to pay your mortgage. Your savings goes away, but you still have your mortgage payment. What do you do now? And that's what we were doing. So the good thing is that we've stopped a lot of that. We've used minimal amounts of reserves to try to bridge gaps where we need to, but really focused on our long-term fiscal health that's paid off in the way of bond rating increases and long-term stability. A lot of focus on looking at central services and how do we've reviewed and done audits, performance audits of our central services, really tried to be as efficient and effective with those central services that we provide to the rest of the organization. Looking at benefit cost management, our health insurance costs, We spend a lot of money each year on employee health insurance, and we value those benefits. We want our employees to be healthy and well and productive, but it's also very costly, and the more that grows, the more it takes away from our ability to invest in the services that the public relies on. Looking at our PERS side account, debt payoff, so all these things that we can manage our sort of internal expenses that don't impact direct services. Then we hit the pandemic and holiday farm fires, and that drives this sort of influx in resources from the state and federal government, right? And creates a bit of a smokescreen because we received all this fund to respond to the needs in the community, a lot of one-time money that was critical at the time. And now what we've seen is that's driven some high inflation, and it's helped further create some of the structural imbalance that that we're facing today. So we have seen an increase in wages. Those increases are important, because of inflation. We want to be competitive in the market. We've seen that across the board through all of our, bargaining units, represented and non-represented employees. And it largely is the challenge that we face here today. So this is a very simple math problem. It's a very simple math problem with a hugely complex set of solutions to try to fix it. The math problem is the money going out the door is leaving faster than the money that we can collect coming in the door, right? Our expenses are growing faster than our revenues. And I want to focus on the distressed funds. I think I have this slide and one more, and then I'm done. The distressed funds, we talk a lot about the general fund, and that there's a tendency maybe to think, well, if I'm not in the general fund, then I'm not affected. The general fund is the mothership. In every government, city and county and state, there's a general fund. There's a general pot of resources with some discretion on how you spend it. And what you're able to do, the governing bodies can do in those situations, is you identify where do we have priorities and where can we not collect enough tax revenue or set fees at a rate that pays for the cost of those services. And that you can say the general fund will help subsidize that. So if you look at counties, all of our comparable counties, these other areas, public safety, areas like building permits and land management, parole and probation services, public health, behavioral health services, they're subsidized by the general fund. Parks, subsidized by the general fund. They all make contributions to those areas, those other funds, because they recognize those areas cannot generate enough revenue to provide the level of service the community wants to see. We don't do that in Lane County because we don't have enough general fund to put enough deputies on patrol in rural Lane County or district attorneys to prosecute all the offenses or assessment and taxation staff to do appraisals and the work that we have to do there. So we have problems within the general fund just in terms of the amount of resources there to have the staffing levels to deliver the service we need there. That's the problem. And then we don't have enough money from the general fund to share in these other areas to help those areas be solvent. So it creates this broader kind of sinking, right? The mothership is getting pulled down by these different really heavy anchors. And you see what's driving that. In the general fund, it's property tax revenue that's growing at 3.5%, and I'll show you expenses are growing at 9.6%. Simple math problem. How we fix it is much more complex. Public safety levy fund, we have some challenges. Again, the revenue that we're collecting in the public safety levy of 2013 originally fund is not meeting the growth in expenses. In land management, we use fees and no property taxes. We've subsidized it with some video lottery dollars and one-time dollars, right? And it's not sustainable, so it's not structurally solvent. In parole and probation, same thing, state funding, that's not keeping pace with the level of service and the growth in expenses. And then I want to just pivot here. Eve, do you want to touch on Health and Human Services, which is a whole other set of sort of dynamics?
Sure. We've been doing our budget work for this coming fiscal year in Health and Human Services probably since July 1st, right? Right as soon as we got the budget approved for this current fiscal year. We have a number of really complicating factors in within our department. So historically, we've had some areas where revenues have consistently exceeded expenses, other areas where there's consistently been a challenge with structural balance. And we've been able, over the last couple of years, to kind of share resources, offload some of our ask on the general fund, knowing these other challenges, and become more self-sufficient. That trend has completely reversed itself this year, and there are a number of complicating factors. One is we responded pretty rapidly to community needs last year with the closure of our only hospital in the city of Eugene, a recognition that we needed access to same-day services for our patient population. We opened the West 11th Clinic. We had a long-term commitment to the South Lane Clinic. We have opened that. And we had a provider in town who began to shed staff. Particularly physician, nurse practitioner, and physician associate staff. And rather than seeing all of those primary care providers leave our community, we hired at a much more rapid pace than would be typical running a medical group because we felt that it was in the best interest of our community. When you're growing in a medical setting, you incur expenses immediately when you hire and open clinics, and it takes time to bring on the patient population in order to bring in the revenues to cover those expenses. We anticipated running a deficit. We did not anticipate how rapidly some of our one-time funds would be run through with cost overruns in some of our capital projects because of the rapid pace of inflation, with the rapid pace of inflation related to salaries and the need to pay for that. And that exacerbated what we knew was going to be a deficit into something that's going to be much more challenging for us to solve. So we are in the midst of identifying both expenditure reductions. We have leaned into strategies such as the elimination, I believe we identified more than $3 million in vacant positions that we are taking off the books. We are eliminating a number of contract labor options, particularly locums, contract providers, and taking some other measures to try to prevent ourselves from digging deeper into this fiscal year. Looking into next fiscal year, it's going to be a bigger challenge to balance our budget and to get back to a place where the community health centers are bringing in revenue in excess of expenses. So we're looking at that piece on top of public health. Developmental disabilities rely very heavily on state funding, federal funding. Neither of those are priorities right now for the governor, particularly developmental disabilities that is 100% state funded. Public health there are some proposed cuts to public health prevention federally going into March, and there have been some significant limitations on revenue growth in public health at the state level, and our expenses are growing as fast as Steve mentioned. So when the governor puts a 1% increase, and our state agencies are wanting to take that to reinforce themselves, it puts us at risk. So there's some that we know now. There's more that we will learn as the legislative session proceeds. And so budget is kind of the first step. And then we identify what the state budget looks like. We identify what any continuing resolution looks like at the federal level, which will impact a number of the other areas. Our other two operational areas are gubernatorial priorities. That's behavioral health, housing, and homelessness. There's also some question federally about investment in some of those services. And so we receive it's not all state funding in those areas. We receive quite a bit of federal funding. So what's going to happen if we receive a buoy at the state level? What is that going to look like federally? What are the projections around Medicaid is another big question that we're facing. So all of these complicating factors are leading toward not only a budget where we see deficits, and that's true across a number of funds, and also this sense of uncertainty. And I want to just take a moment to, all of this is about the numbers, and we're talking a lot about the numbers, and yet we have more than 2,000 people who work for us and who depend on us for a livelihood and for taking care of their families. And as we are facing budget reductions, you know, our focus, our emphasis continues to be anything that we can do to generate revenue or to reduce expenditures in a way that it doesn't impact our people negatively. And the deficits that we are facing are just really significant enough that it's beginning to feel like all of those other things that we've been trying to do to balance our budget, we're running a little bit short of, well, in some cases a little, and in some cases more, short of our ability to balance our budget, utilizing those strategies. So, you know, we are deep in this in Health and Human Services, and I know that everyone else is getting to be deep in this as well. So, you know, I think focus on our people, communication, really frequent communication to our people is another commitment that we just have to make this budget cycle because of the level of uncertainty. So hopefully that, okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Eve. This is the last slide, Chair, and then we can take a break if you would like. But thank you, Eve, for that. And we'll talk a little bit more as we get into kind of general fund and other fund impacts and sort of the goals and values that we're trying to lead with and additional direction. You know, this is the general fund story that we're projecting at this point. Revenue raising at about 3.2%, expenses raising at 9.6%. That's the math problem. As Eve said, this is more than just math. It impacts people we employ and people we serve. That's the process we're going to go through, is to talk about how, you know, we've talked about here a little bit of the why. Why are we in this situation we're in? A little bit of the what we've done to deal with it in the past, and what we're looking at now, and then we need to go through, you know, how are we going to address these challenges as we move forward. So general fund structural imbalance meaning it's plug it with one-time money from reserves, it just grows, right? It's going to get back to where it was last year, plus on top of that the growth, the gap that we have here. So you see that we call this the JAWS graph. The red, as long as the red bar is above the blue bar, it's bad, right? It means there's a gap between, we have less money coming in than we have going out. And that's what forces these conversations around how do we close that gap? What do we need to do to make those adjustments without impacting or minimizing the impact, if possible, to our employees and to the public that we serve. Okay, so we'll talk more about this. We're going to get into, there is a slide that Christine has that will provide some detail around general fund. Where are the general fund dollars going by service category? So you really can look at, like, when we think about making reductions to bridge this gap, where does that happen? That's the really difficult part of this conversation.
Thank you very much. I know that Commissioner Farr has a comment. Do you want to do it now, Commissioner Farr, or do you want to do it later?
know, I think, Steve, you've done a good job of summarizing things, brilliant job of painting the picture of what was happening 10 years ago, prior to 10 years ago, and how the increases don't even come close to making up the deficits that occurred more than 10 years ago. Nothing more on that. Let's take a break and go on with it.
All right, sounds good. The time right now is about 10:16. Let's take a break to 10:25 sharp. We'll come back for this meeting. We are recessed. budget leadership, kickoff leadership meeting for 2025. Just a program note for all those involved. Vice Chair Senegal will be wrapping up this meeting. I've got to catch a flight leaving here by 11:15. So as procedures are going on, I will just quietly exit. And then the rest of you professionals will take our budget to where no man has gone before. So let's hopefully that. All right, so if you would, let's start off with Christine Moody, our budget officer, who will continue explaining us some general funds of where we are going and where we're heading.
Thank you, Chair. So going to start with, as Steve mentioned, talking a bit about where we're spending the general fund now, trying to give some context. When we hear a number of 6.3 million, sometimes that's hard to equate to where we're spending money now. And while, of course, we don't have specific impacts for you, you can see the amounts that are being spent in various areas, and that tells the story of just how difficult this budget will be as just in the way that Eve described too. But I'll give a little more specific on the general fund, maybe, if the clicker's working. Can you advance back there? It's not working. Maybe we're frozen. Maybe it's not the clicker. Here we go. Okay. So I thought I'd start out, even though we've talked a little bit about the revenue in the general fund, this doesn't include our fund balance, which is our reserves that just carries forward year and becomes reserves. But this, and a lot of this is internal. So when you start with administrative charges, about 6 from the bottom, that's going to be internal money moving around between funds. But it gives a good picture of property taxes at the top, showing you that the bulk of the general fund money is property taxes. And as we've discussed, the slow growth of that property tax is part of how we end up with our deficit. All right, clicker's working now, Jennifer. So I have removed from this pie, you've seen variations of this pie. In our budget document, we talk about where we're spending what we refer to as discretionary general fund. Now, as you heard, the general fund as a whole is our most discretionary fund. It does contain money, though, from department activities. So we don't include those revenues when we're talking about discretionary general fund. And why we don't do that, a good example would be in the sheriff's office, where they're selling concealed handgun licenses. If they stop doing that service and we cut the staff selling those licenses, the revenue would go away. So we exclude that revenue, and we talk only about the discretionary general fund, which is primarily property taxes, timber revenue, some of those state-shared revenues, and a limited amount of fees and charges that occur within the general fund. So this is predominantly revenue that does not come into department budgets, and then we allocate it out to departments. So here you've seen the pie before with it having reserves on it and with it having central services mixed in with the general government. And then we have a little bit of debt that we pay for the public health building, which has a couple years left. And so there's a little bit of debt service that you'll see in the chart that's in the budget document. But here I've narrowed it down to those direct services. And so then we're looking at percentages that look just a little bit different. 78% of that discretionary general fund goes to the category of public safety. And then public health and welfare has 9% and general government 13%. And then the next slide gives you some ideas of numbers. So the top 5 public safety services in that 78% are the amounts that you see up here. It starts with the most general fund going to our law enforcement 911 response patrol, the violent offender jail capacity. Then we move to the DA's office with their criminal prosecution. And then youth services, detention and treatment being almost 4 million, and supervision services being 2.6. I should clarify, I should have put at the top of the slide, these are 24-25 adopted budget numbers. So last year's adopted, because obviously we haven't developed what, all of these will be higher cost in 25-26. There are only 2 direct general government services in the pie that I showed on the last slide. So I'm showing you both of them here. They are now assessment and taxation, election voter registration, which also includes our recording office where we do deeds and records. So that's, maybe should say county clerk. It's those functions there. So assessment and taxation, 6.6 million almost. Elections at the 1.9 million. Then the top 5 public health and welfare services, we look at human services, the human services division, animal services at just under 700,000, women, infants, and children's program, referred to as WIC, the Dawn to Dawn shelter, and high-risk pregnancy women's and infants. I should mention also, these are top 5 on 2 of them. We prepare what we refer to as service option sheets for every discretionary general fund dollar that is spent. Those are provided to the budget committee every year. We post them on our website. They are still out there from last year and prior years. And they are meant to describe the services that are being purchased with the discretionary general fund. The type of service that you're receiving and the FTE that's providing that service. Those sheets will also talk about leveraged funding because a lot of times when we put money in, and this is the case in a lot of these, but I know in some of those public health and welfare, we're putting some general fund in and then we're getting quite a bit of other state money, state and federal money that is making that program much larger. Our money goes a lot further. We leverage other funds. So the initial forecast, you saw the graph, the 6.3 million is the discretionary general fund deficit for 25-26 projected at this time. As Steve mentioned, that is revenue growth of 3.2%. I will tell you property taxes are estimated to grow 3.5%. So seeing that 3.2% tells you what the rest of the fund revenue is doing. It is not keeping up with the 3.5. It's pretty modest. The expenditure growth, 9.6. I will say this is the highest expenditure number I think I've ever reported as the budget manager. It is because of the high inflation and the high increase in wages and benefits is primarily causing that.
I just want to make a note here that what this doesn't assume, and this is to say we're talking about a challenge we're facing next year, but it's important to remember, even when we solve that problem, the problem continues every year. One of the things that the projection doesn't include is we're bargaining with three different bargaining units actually this year. And one of them, the Deputies Association, Lane County Peace Officers Association, is, I don't know if it's not 100%, but it's the majority of, is in the general fund and the levy fund. Between the sheriff's office and youth services primarily. So that is not whatever, because we have to go into bargaining, so that's not estimated here. So again, when we just think about the continued growth that will happen, and then you look at the options available on the last slide, that's the challenge of this conversation.
So I mentioned the property tax growth of 3.5. The other external revenue is fairly slow growth. There is an increase in the administrative charges, what we refer to it in our budget. That is really our other non-general funds paying back the general fund for its central services that it provides, because all of our central services except for technology services are found within the general fund. And so the general fund pays for those and then bills the other funds and collects that money back. Personnel, so benefits and wages are actually growing 10.6% year over year is the forecast prior to the bargaining that was mentioned. We are also adjusting the vacancy variance rate slightly from what we have in current year. Current year budget, we have 5.5% vacancy variance rate. As we start reducing vacant positions and FTE, those will be vacant. You start with your vacants primarily, and you're going to not have as much vacancy variance. So you're gonna start to squeeze the fund too tight, and we have found in the current fiscal year, you will most likely see supplemental 4 having to give some vacancy variance back to our general fund departments. It's a little too tight this year. And that's just, history does not always tell us what's going to happen the next year, but it's the indicator that we use when we build the budget. So backing off that vacancy variance a little bit. This is also a biennium when PERS rates are adjusted. The employer PERS rate is adjusted for 25-27. The market has not done as well as PERS hopes and projects when they are doing their growth estimates. And when wages go up faster than have been projected, then the retirement benefit goes up. And so PERS starts to go the wrong way as far as their forecasts. So on the employer rate side, our rate went up dramatically. because of those higher wages. And that was really seen across the state. So when I've gone to the PERS board meetings, they're talking about the percent of salary growth happening statewide, catching up with that inflation has been higher than they've seen, and that's causing negative impacts to PERS and employer rates. For us, as you'll remember, we issued a PERS bond in 2022. We basically paid off the liability that we had at the time, financed it at a pretty low interest rate, and then invested it with PERS with the hope that you earn enough in investment that your rate holds off and is lower. That's having a little negative impact, so that's part of why our employer rate is going up, because our side account is being drawn a little faster because wages are higher. However, we also internally started a PERS reserve fund because we want to make sure that we, as salaries are a little more volatile, that we have enough reserve to always make that bond payment every year that's going to be due no matter what. So in our reserve fund, salaries going higher and us charging a percentage internally to build that reserve is positive. The reserve was building a little bit faster, while it was negative over on the PERS employer rate. So those are we were almost able to offset most of our employer rate with our bond adjustment. So explaining, even though it was a pretty dramatic employer rate, internally we were able to smooth it, which is exactly why we have that PERS bond reserve. The medical rate increase, 8%. We're starting to see positive trends here with our actual claims in the current year. But you might remember that last year we kept rates artificially low and used reserves out of the benefit fund in order to hold those rates lower. We have to pay for that now because our reserves are low, and we have to build them back up because if claims come in higher, we just get a monthly bill. Twice a month, we pay the claims no matter how high they go. We have a little bit of insurance on some individual claims, but so we have to catch up with what we did last year. So that's the bulk of what this increase is in order to get that fund back to where it should be. Material and services growth, we look at the December Oregon Economic Forecast and what they are projecting for CPI growth for the West region as the base for our budget building, and so that'll be 3% is what they're saying for 25-26. The out years, then it starts to drop to about 2.4, 2.6 over the 5-year period that we look for in the general fund. So assumptions, we've mentioned some of these, and then some cautions. So there are a few one-time things that are in the budget now that we are assuming are ending or moving where they're funded. So we mentioned that first expanded patrol of 4 FTE is scheduled to run out of funding. It may have a little bit left, but it's scheduled to run out of funding at the end of the current fiscal year. So the forecast assumes that that is not funded with general fund, or it finds other funding in 25-26. We also assume that because the sheriff's office part of CCA JRI funding is in the general fund, we're assuming that the state does come back and pick up what the general fund was covering with a one-time transfer. So that's, I think in the current year, about $414,000. It was more over the biennium because we received less money in the first year, but we're assuming that state revenue catches back up. We're also assuming that Secure Rural Schools is not renewed, and why I mentioned that, especially for the general fund, is for the general fund and ongoing revenue, because of how timber revenue is trending right now, it's actually a slight negative to the general fund if SRS is renewed. So even though the budget that Steve showed, our budget right now in the current fiscal year, we assume about $3.7 million in timber revenue. I've just recently received the monthly timber reports from O&C Land, so I see what those are trending. We'll probably get close to $4 million in the current year. And so SRS would be about $3.4 million. So our forecast still assumes the $3.75 million. So we would get about $300,000 less in ongoing general fund if SRS is renewed. Now, I will also mention that it's very positive for the road fund. So this is why Lane County still does not opt out of Secure Rural Schools, which we could do. We could say we're going to take the timber revenue, but it's millions additional revenue to the road fund. And as was mentioned the last time we received the 3-year renewal, we took half of that towards roads and bridge projects, the excess, the one time, and half of it to do the expanded patrol number 2 with 8 FTE. So that's a big benefit to the county. So the one-time expenditures that are still in the fund, that expanded Patrol 2 with 8 FTE, it's a road fund transfer, but we assume that that is one time and it would go away. Holiday Farm Fire Recovery staff, it's just 1 FTE, but it is staff in the fund we're still counting as one time. Grant management staff, our previous ARPA team, who are doing some county-wide grant management work to assist departments and county as a whole, is 3 FTE. It is funded with an ARPA award of funding, and so will run out here within a year or two. And then there are a few limited duration positions in different departments. So the total one-time expenses that we still have services in the fund that are being funded by one-time money are about $4.5 million in 25-26. And I have removed that expense in order to get to the 6.3. So if that was counted and these were ongoing, the deficit would go up by $4.5 million. So here's just the bottom line of the revenue and expenditures to show that 6.3. As we look out the 5 years, it really does get very dependent on how we solve our budget challenges in 25-26. So it makes it a little harder to forecast. But the deficit starts to stabilize. This is the largest year in the 5 years, 25-26. It still continues to grow just slightly. And then when we get out to 27-28 and 29-30, we will pay off our 2002 PERS bond, which is about 4% of payroll. And we will pay off the public health building, which is about $680,000 from the general fund every year. So we see a couple positives where it starts to flatten if we were to look back at I should have put the JAWS graph again here, but if you look at the one that Steve had, it starts to flatten as it gets towards the end of the 5 years. All right, I think we're gonna move into, unless there's any questions on the forecast, I could ask that. Anything on what was there? No.
Do we field questions from all folks? Can we do that?
You can.
Yeah, let's go ahead. Yeah, if you have a question, go ahead. I wasn't either, so we're going to test it out. So be good.
I think my question was for the distressed funds that was in the prior presentation. If we had actual dollar amounts attached to those specific funds.
Her question, just for everybody with the mic, was whether for the distressed funds that were showed on a prior slide have dollar amounts assumed with them. We could get to probably current year adopted, but we're developing 25-26. So they're structurally imbalanced already. There's been no revenue fix, and so they're presumed to still be. So we will have those as part of the proposed budget. Yeah.
Just for the record, who asked that question?
Jen Maurer, AFSCME president.
Jen Maurer, AFSCME president. All right, great, thank you.
Okay.
Sure.
Yes.
I've got a couple questions, actually. Since we're talking about the general fund and our sheriff's department coming out of it, Mr. Mocher-Heise, he kind of hit on the 27% FTE increase. I'd like to get a little bit more in depth at some point. But first, I didn't see anything about assessment and taxation FTE. Like, where are we at on that?
Okay. Thank you, Vice Chair. Thank you, Chair. I love talking about taxes. It's kind of lighten the mood here. So in 2009, assessment and taxation had 60 FTE, and today we have 48 FTE. We've grown by 20,000 property tax accounts. The Oregon Department of Revenue has a formula based on the number of property tax accounts, the size of the county, and they recommend full-time employees based on those metrics. And we are at 64% of the recommended Department of Revenue FTE. That's a D. We're close to a D minus. So historically, Lane County has not funded assessment and taxation. Of the 636 employees the county gained in the last 10 years, we're at a net zero. There are more legislative mandates that we have to administer every year, us and the finance, central finance. And the 3.5% revenue growth is not a guarantee. I know that some districts, because I work for 85 of them, have an assumption that the 3.5% is a guarantee, but we have hands on everything. We have to have the people supporting the functions. So one thing that I'm doing, I'm partnering with Technology Services. We're partnering with Micah Brown to look at how AI, artificial intelligence, can help us become more efficient. We're looking at a contract with C3 AI to incorporate ML, multiple listing service data. I knew you knew that one.
Thank you.
To try and prioritize property inspections. We haven't visited 35% of our residential properties in 25 to 30 years. We know we're leaving money on the table. We have done pocket studies in the last couple of years. And I say pocket studies because if I could tell you the return on investment, we would have been to all the properties, right? We would have done all the audits, but we can't because we don't have the FTE to do that. So, and for those of you who have heard this, which is probably a lot of you, I apologize. But it is my belief that the property tax base is the district's single most important asset, and you have to invest in that asset to realize the investment. If we're talking about long-term financial and fiscal health, property taxes is a place to start. It won't solve our problem next year. I understand that. I would never overpromise. But maybe in 5 years, maybe in 10 years, I think that, and of course, this is my department and I'm passionate about this, but if we are going to look at long-term health, we really need to look at our revenue machine and support the people and the technologies that move us forward instead of catching us on our heels year after year. So, thank you.
Yes, Christine.
Maybe just one additional comment, because you mentioned the 27% growth, I think is what Steve calculated for the public safety. So that was all funds. And I think this also plays in with A&T because A&T has the CAFA grant, which has continually gone down. So while FTE has not increased, the cost of FTE and the general fund that is backfilling the state not fulfilling their promises is increasing.
Yeah.
So
thank you.
And then those other places in public safety that have seen FTE for the most part are in the non-general fund areas. For the most part, there have been some general fund increases as well, especially in the DA's office in more recent years. But it's going to be that other funding and not the general fund that's able to make those increases.
Chair, can I follow up on that? So the grant that Ms. Moody talked about is, it was not indexed at its inception. So it's not growing with inflation, it's flat. So as Steve's, showed us that the job graph, right, expenses are growing faster than revenue. The legislative effort that Steve Adams talked about is diversifying that fund. So as you all know, Lane County is the only district out of 85 that pays for assessment and taxation services. Right or wrong, that's how it is. So what we want to do with this bill is we want to increase the recording fees. We want to have the districts pay 0.3% of, actually us recuperate 0.3% of all the money generated, of all the revenue generated, and then have a $5 million state general fund contribution, which was originally in the grant and then got taken away in 2010, which led to our layoffs, right? That Secure Rural Schools, was sort of the perfect storm for us to, not have very much revenue. So that's sort of the legislative effort on the CAFA funding and stabilizing that. And that, I think it's a multi-pronged approach, and that is one of the aspects of it.
That's an AOC priority too. That's not a Lane County, just to be clear. There
That's correct,
more
yes,
counties
thank
than
you.
Lane County working on
Yeah, that's, thank you. That is the Association of Oregon Counties top governance priority. It is a priority shared by assessors and tax collectors statewide. It's a Lane County priority. Yeah, thank you for that.
Yes, Vice Chair.
This might be more for Sheriff Harold and Dave Perosa. So we'll start with Sheriff Harold. Those 27% increase, and it's looking like we're possibly going to lose 12 deputies
Overtime.
over time. But I mean, so that 27% is actually going to go down quite a bit if we lost those 12, I would assume.
Yeah, so speaking of the 27%, it was listed on the slide as 165.2 FTE growth in public safety. Once the levy passed, we have added 81 sworn deputy sheriffs since the levy passed. Keep in mind, we cut 200 positions out of the sheriff's office from 08 to 12. 100 of those were actual layoffs, but 200 positions were cut. So we've recovered 81 sworn deputy positions since the levy passed. So that accounts for almost 50% of that 165 growth. And those are just sworn deputy positions. I know we've got, a couple maintenance specialists at the jail, a couple records officers at the jail that are funded with the levy, so that would increase just slightly.
I think that was actually, you're probably good then, huh? I mean, I think that attributed to the staff.
Chair, can I say one more thing? Thank you. When I said that the 3.5% growth isn't a guarantee, we have to protect the revenue and the value that we currently have, and we do that through having qualified appraisal staff go to appeals to represent us at the Board of Property Tax Appeals, which is not called that right now. It changed its name, and the magistrate and on up. So we have to protect the value that we currently have. If we don't do that, then that 3.5% is in jeopardy.
I believe Commissioner Buck, oh, maybe she took her hand down.
Commissioner Buck, did you have a question?
I did, thank you, Chair. In the presentation, a couple slides back, you had listed the budget items that we're no longer considering in the 25-26, excuse me. Yes, this slide. And I just wanted to verify, like, every single one of those things that you've listed there are going to end June 30th of this year. Is that correct?
Well, unless there is additional funding identified. So that's really what I'm saying here is I have not assumed that the general fund starts like the 4 FTE for expanded patrol because that was a one-time pot of money. When it runs out of money, it's assumed it goes away. So, and then the other one is the state revenue. I think the sheriff has something to add. Yeah.
Just as far as those 4 positions, the 2 McKinsey and 2 West Lane, when we approached the board about setting aside funds for 5 years of funding, we were a little slow to get the positions filled. And this is budget kickoff, so we haven't had a chance to have this conversation, but our strategy is that we, effective January 1st of this year, we reduced that to 1 position on the McKinsey Highway and 1 position in West Lane, so as to slow down our spending of those dollars with hopes that we could keep staffing of 1 and 1 through the fiscal year. But that's a strategy that we will talk further about down the road.
And that is for it through the 25-26 year, hoping to keep those 2 staff on for that fiscal year.
That's what we're hoping.
Okay. And then the grant management staff, you had mentioned that there was some ARPA money still available. Are all 3 of those FTE ending June 30th, or do we have some extension of those employees as well?
Thank you, Commissioner. So beginning with where it says one-time expenditures within the fund, nothing below that is scheduled to end on June 30th of this year. So those are items that are still going to be in the 25-26 budget that are one-time, they're funded with one-time money. So there's still money for the expanded patrol 2, the holiday farm fire staff, the grant management staff, and a few limited duration. So just highlighting those.
What I needed to know.
Yes.
I thought at first all of them were ending June 30th, but just the top 3.
Correct. Yeah.
Thank you.
Commissioner Trigger?
No.
Question? Oh, sorry, I thought you had a question. Anyone else before we move on? All right, Christine, you still have the floor, so go ahead.
Yeah. So just budget calendar and some basic budget direction. Are we worried about time? Is that, no, okay.
We're good.
No,
We
we're
have a
good
lot
for
of
time.
discussion at the end, I
Yeah.
think. So, yeah, okay. Budget calendar, you saw some of this on Steve's very first slide. So budget kickoff today, and then moving into those departments will, and how this applies back to the forecast. Maybe I should also, I'm assuming when I'm doing the forecast for the general fund, while I talk a lot about discretionary general fund, it is the entire general fund that I'm forecasting. So it is also department revenue that I'm forecasting. Now, we communicate and they warn me if they hear about something where revenue is going to go down. But until we go build that budget and they have a chance to do their analysis, it really is an initial forecast. So the piece about departments really, especially for me, the general fund, with that forecast, going out and verifying, okay, what do we really think it's going to look like? And then turning in their submitted budgets to the budget office in February. And then moving on through the budget committee process and just highlighting for you that in April is when we have an actual printed proposed document. It is the last week of April. Steve mentioned, and he might jump in here too, we talked about how our budget process has started early. While it says December, I think the budget office always starts in December, so I think it was before that, actually. So should have had an earlier date there. But we've been having budget discussions at the department director level and really focused on central services, which I've listed for you there, which has included some 5 and 10% reduction scenarios that are being reviewed and are either being built into budgeted rates because we have internal rates that we charge, or part of initial budget direction. But I'll turn it over to Steve if he has any additional thoughts.
As I mentioned earlier, we started this year early, and we've had a lot of conversations with our department leadership, going back to, I'd say, like October timeframe, and we've now, actually this afternoon, we have some additional conversations with departments about central services. We have asked, again, all of our central services, so these are the functions within the organization that provide services to all the direct services to make sure that they're effective. And you see the list of those areas: technology and legal counsel and human relations and administration, financial services, budget, policy team, operations, facilities. So the elements that are critical for any organization to be able to operate effectively. Typically, about 20% of every dollar spent in a central service area is paid for by the general fund. This is important to note that, if you cut $1 in a central service, you save about 20 cents in the general fund, which is why, we want to be very deliberate and thoughtful about that. But we do feel like, as we're looking at, continued constraints, we want to have the conversation about how we manage those central services effectively. So we've asked all those areas and continue to review and have discussions about places in which we can make between 5 and 10% reductions. Those are not finalized. We're having conversations about those scenarios and really trying to be thoughtful. We are not going to do an across the board. Everyone takes 5%, everyone takes 10%. That's not, really all that does is spread the mediocrity. What we're trying to do is have these targets and scenarios, and then have conversations about what are the impacts of reductions in these areas. That's what a thoughtful budgeting process should do. When you have to make reductions, you consider where you would make those, and then you try to understand what the impact of it is, and be deliberate and thoughtful in those discussions. So, also want to share. Well, I think I'll make that note after. So why don't you keep going?
Okay, just about done here. Mentioning that departments will do their adjusted base. So some of this we've kind of touched on. That's how we verify the forecast in particular. And we see, we have current year budget numbers, like I showed you. This is what's 24-25 budget. Now we've got to figure out what those same services cost in 25-26. And that's our starting point before we start making reductions, in order to very clearly show how much the increase is costing us. And then the direction, we're already talking about spending targets, reductions in cost requests for general fund, analysis of other funding sources. Continuing to turn over every rock and every strategy, and we're always looking for any new idea as we're going through the budget prep process.
And so to our departments for initial budget direction, we continue to include, which has been mentioned, why it matters when we talk about, hey, we've got some things that are being bargained, because we're not including those in forecasts and we're not including those in budgets, in the proposed budget. Not until the Board of Commissioners approves and signs ratifies a contract or has a board order that changes compensation, do we assume anything in the budget beyond merit increases and step increases for existing employees. We will include a vacancy variance in all funds and really be analyzing that, as I said, as we're reducing vacant positions. We have to be really careful that we don't assume too much vacancy because we don't see as much then. Our benefit rates, medical rates I already mentioned, and that's because we used reserves. Dental rates going up slightly, and I mentioned our PERS rate increases that are happening. And then material and services, and as a whole, with the general fund, for many years, we have done zero-based budgeting. So we really ask our departments to start from scratch. What is it you need today? Don't just incrementally increase all your line items, but really strategize and figure out what's needed for the service, the existing service today, and sometimes that growth looks a little different than we're forecasting. And then the overall budget goals. And you want me to turn this back to you? I mean, I can read them. Do you want to make a comment? Yeah.
Yeah, I think, we've talked about a lot of this, and we'll, Chair, turn it over to the board for additional thoughts and feedback and guidance. We want to seek to achieve a structurally balanced budget. Again, that means revenues equal expenses as much as possible, and limit the use of our reserves to balance. If we can't structurally balance and we have to use reserves, we at least want to know that there's a plan in place, or we're putting a plan in place, so we're not just deficit spending year over year. We want to continue to meet our reserve policies, and as I said, minimize the use of reserves. And then you've talked about this a little bit, seek to limit the reduction in current service levels aligned with our strategic priorities. We will be, after this meeting, sending out a communication to all of our employees to share with them what we talked about here this morning generally, provide links to all of this information. One of the things that we feel like is very important for our workforce is that we keep folks in the loop on what's happening. There's a lot of uncertainty ahead. There's uncertainty not just here in terms of understanding the financial challenges Lane County itself within our house is dealing with, but also what is monitoring what's happening at the State House and monitoring what's happening in the Capitol in Washington, D.C. and the impacts of those. Well, those things are going to unfold over the course of the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months, probably mostly in the next 6 months. And so we're going to do everything we can to keep folks informed as that information develops. We're going to be deliberate in our decision making, and again try to limit the impacts to services and employment. But the reality is, as you see here, we have very limited places that we can make reductions without impacting some critical areas. So I think that's everything, and we want to turn it over, Chair, to you and the board for any additional questions, thoughts, and any additional guidance that the board would like to provide as we seek to develop our proposed budget for you.
All right, thank you, Steve. Thank you, Christine. Great work. We caught up on a little bit of time. So we do have about 25 minutes for some final thoughts and some final questions. If the board wouldn't mind, I'd like to ask a couple of questions due to my limited time left, if that would be okay. I heard a question, or a statement rather, that said the one-time money, when it goes away, so does the positions. And I'm wondering if that's a strategy that we're now going to take hold of, because sometimes that does happen and sometimes it doesn't happen. So I'm wondering if that's just going to be one of those like lines in the sands we're drawing as of 2025.
I would say that's not starting in 2025. That is the structural balance of the fund. So when you have a sense, the work that began after Steve was hired in 17-18 was the first time we achieved structural balance in the general fund, where we were saying ongoing revenue and ongoing expenses equal each other. So that's why I'm tracking those things that really are one time, and if they don't go away, and you have financial policy, the board has had financial policies for a long time, saying when you get a grant, don't, assume that sunsets when the grant goes away. When you have a contract with somebody, assume that service sunsets. So that is how we are treating the use of reserves as well.
Good, thank you. And then Mary, you said that we have a D- on the taxation thing. And as you were talking about this, the thought of my mind was, we're always talking about revenue and expenses, and obviously this is starting to sound like a business, even though we're a government body. But it seems to me like maybe the priorities we need to think about as a board is to what are our revenue generators and how can we really invest in those, maybe even at somewhat of a risk level, to get some return on our investments over maybe the next course of a year or two, like you had set that out. And I guess one of the questions I had to kind of balance that question in my mind was, where would we be at tax-wise per thousand estimate today if we had that 6% prior to the Measure 5047 storm that hit? Where would we be kind of progressively today if that didn't play into effect? Just so in my mind and in the public's mind, we could get a sense of really we should be here with what's fair rather than having this artificial belief that, oh no, we pay enough taxes already to cover everything. So I guess that maybe would help the public's perception of what money we really could have had we've not been hamstrung by the state measures and what we really should be paying, which is, I guess, unquote, the fair share of taxable income. Yes, Christine.
Chair, I'll just share one thing. When I gave a presentation to the Public Safety Task Force, I did a lot of reading of, and I have over the years in the time of my role, reading of old budget documents to try and figure out what was happening back in the 70s when I was in grade school. But that base levy was not guaranteed a 6%. So in the 1971 or around there, I even found where the Attorney General of the state said everyone's rates are frozen until further notice. So I guess I would just caution a little bit that we would then assume that we would have grown 6%. Another thing that we didn't really highlight here, but our rate of $1.27.9, thankfully, we had some levies in place related to the jail, related to extension service, because what they did to create everyone's permanent rate is they said, we're going to combine everything you have. So if we hadn't had some other rates that really were meant for specific services, even our permanent rate would be lower. So I think our base rate, what we found in the research was like that 60 cents to 90 cents. So hard to recreate a history that didn't exist a little bit. I mean, we can definitely come up with projections of if it had grown a certain percentage, but maybe just caveating that with, it doesn't mean that that system worked exactly that way. It seems more complex the more
I understand that. I'm just trying to wrap my head around from a public sense. If we're going to ask for a special taxing district for, say, our public safety levy, and they're kind of waging out or balancing out in their mind what should have been fair. I mean, education and information is power to get someone to, release a little bit more of their money toward government. So that's what I was thinking. The last thing that I wanted just to kind of put out there just as a thought was, in the last number of weeks, we've had a good number of people come to the Board of County Commissioners meetings asking us about feeling safer and that their safety feels threatened, and that safety has been a big topic. And so I just want to say that, our public right now is asking us to be safer. And I think as we move forward in the budget, my emphasis would be to make sure that we are answering that call and that question in the best way that we can. And if that means that sometimes maybe some things have to pause for a while for us to invest a little bit in our public safety and well-being so that it keeps people from moving out of here because they feel unsafe, or it keeps, periphery folks that are on the margins feeling like they're not welcomed, that we need to kind of invest in that. So that's just my own personal thought, and I'd welcome some other thoughts from other commissioners. Commissioner Farr.
Thank you. Just generally speaking, and looking at both you, Christine, and Steve, you did a good presentation regarding putting us historically where we are, particularly pointing out historically where the funding came from. If you look at the corner of this building over here, there are 3 county commissioners that paid cash for this building, wrote a check for building this building. That was Peter DeFazio, Jerry Rust, and Bill Rogers, I believe, are the 3 on there. In those days, you could write checks because of the funding that we had. And we all know, and we all see every year, that the funding that's diminished through federal timber payments and other resources that we historically have had. And one thing I wanted to point out is what we have been doing with the one-time money, Steve, is we've not been using it to pay the mortgage. We've been using it to pay off debt and other debt in effect, because the mortgage remains after one-time monies are gone or one-time revenues are gone. we do a superbly good job of that. And I think that for everybody in the room who wasn't here more than 10 years ago, and there aren't too many people that weren't here more than 10 years ago, remembering what it was like during those days. And Christine, you were talking about being in grade school in the 70s. I was working at Jerry's in the 70s. And, it was things are different, even though there were constraints in place. But I'm not going to talk about what we're doing with the budget, but historically thinking as we in our different departments ask for more of what we have based upon what we had, putting in perspective of how the percentage that we have based upon what we actually have. And I think that one thing we do lose track of quite often is the fact that we are the primary care for how many? Close to 30,000 people in Lane County rely on Lane County for primary care. And the other thing that you pointed out, Steve, is that we are an arm of the state government. We rely more on state and federal funding than the cities do. So I hope city councilors are listening right now and understanding that when they ask for money to supplant money that has been historically paid to counties, if they ask for it to go directly to cities, they're taking away what is our general source of money and adding to what has not been their general source of money. So as we go into the legislative session, Steve, that's one thing that we'd have to pay attention to, is making certain that we protect what has historically come to counties. And you are getting quite a reputation for loving tax.
Thank you.
And
I worked hard for that.
That's what I'll say. Commissioner Trigger pointed out. In the Association of Oregon Counties legislative priorities, #1 is sustain and protect the property tax asset to the benefit of all property owners and taxing districts through, et cetera, et cetera. You speak loud and clear, and your voice is heard loud and clear throughout the state.
Thank you.
I want to also add, too, that the ONC counties is working on a 75% increase in revenues right now, and they're getting very close to that. So that was the last meeting we had in December that was talked about. So there's some hope on the horizon, I'm hoping.
Commissioner, can I clarify when you say that? Is it a 75% increase or going back to the 75% share?
75%, yeah.
Thank you. And thank you, Chair, for mentioning that so that you can keep us up to date on the activities in that association that we pay dues to. So appreciate that. I want to make 3 points in service to the administrator's request to hear board feedback to help him go back and work on his own county administration department and other departments' budgets. And in the interest of time, and because there's so many people here, I'll just sort of name them, and then maybe at a board meeting, Steve, you and I can talk if it's appropriate to actually make it an assignment or how you might want to roll this into your budgeting process. But 3 items that I'm especially considering. One is we've talked about setting up some kind of fund for emergency response, emergency management and response that we have fair confidence would be replenished, but to help account for the lag time in when there is an emergency, we can be more responsive and charge against that. Because I know there's designated funds that come to us, but it's after the fact and we're in the moment in those emergencies. So where we are with that and whether we're going to be able to build that out in this current budget, I'm going to want to hear more about that. I think that's a really important strategy for service delivery. And then 2 things I'd like my colleagues to consider that, the Board of County Commissioners have very few direct funds that we sort of have some say-so over other than the budget writ large, not to minimize that. But one is each of us has a discretionary fund account. That is, there's some history to what that was. It went away in those really hard times of cuts. It came back. And I would just like all of us to think about whether everybody has a little something that we might be able to do, and whether we might consider, I would certainly be in support of considering some fairly significant reduction to that. But I'll want to talk with Christine a little more about how much of those have been spent, and then we have a joint account for conferences and travel for things where we're representing the full board, so how much we're using that fund. But that could be a place, small amount, but every bit helps, that we could contribute. And then the final piece to consider is Board of County Commissioners have 3 employees. Our county counsel, our county administrator, and an auditor. That position's been vacant for a while, so there's sort of vacancy savings there. It's an important position. I'm not sure now is the time to recruit for it, but we should have some discussion about that. And if not, what does that vacancy savings help with? And perhaps as part of our strategic planning, set some goals around a recruitment timeline for that position. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Anybody else? Perfect timing, Chair. Okay, well, if that's it, Mr. Mokreheiski, we will. Okay, I guess that will end our budget kickoff. Appreciate everybody coming in. Some hard times ahead, but that gives us places to succeed. We are down next week, and the next time we will be back will be January 28th at 9 a.m. here in Harris Hall. Thank you.